A taxi driver helped an old woman on a rainy day. While he was driving her home, he was completely paralyzed when he saw the old lady wearing his deceased wife bracelet. On a dreary October evening in Portland, Maine, 58-year-old Jack Harmon sits behind the wheel of his well-maintained but aging yellow cab, watching sheets of rain pound his windshield. The rhythmic thumping of the wipers barely keeps up with the downpour. Jack rubs his eyes, feeling the weight of a 12-hour shift pressing down on his shoulders. The digital clock on his dashboard reads 8:47 p.m. Business is slow, and Jack is contemplating calling it a night when the dispatcher's voice crackles through the radio. Unit 17, pick up at Maine Medical Center, main entrance. Elderly female passenger. You're the closest. Jack sighs, considering declining the fare. Home is only 15 minutes away, and a hot shower followed by a reheated casserole from Mrs. Delgado next door sounds increasingly appealing. But something, maybe habit, maybe the lingering sense of responsibility that Sarah always admired in him, makes him reach for the radio. Copy that, dispatch. Unit 17 heading to Maine Medical. The wipers swish-swash as Jack navigates the quiet streets. Portland isn't exactly bustling on a Wednesday night, especially not in this weather. Streetlights reflect off the wet pavement, creating golden pools that ripple and distort with each drop of rain. Jack drives past the darkened storefronts of Congress Street, the glow from the occasional bar or restaurant spilling onto empty sidewalks. 3 years. It's been 3 years since he last drove this route to Maine Medical with any personal stake in the journey. Back then, he'd made this trip daily, sometimes twice daily, his heart in his throat each time, wondering if today would be the day Sarah would turn a corner. If today the doctors would use words like remission instead of comfort measures. The memory makes his chest tighten. Jack pulls up to the circular driveway beneath the hospital's covered entrance. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he spots an elderly woman huddled under the awning, clutching a small overnight bag. Her silver hair is tucked beneath a plastic rain bonnet that looks like it's been in her purse since the 1970s. Despite the late hour and miserable weather, she stands straight, with a dignity that reminds Jack of his own mother. He pulls the cab as close to the curb as possible and gets out, popping open a large black umbrella he keeps behind his seat. "Evening, ma'am. You call for a cab?" Jack asks, holding the umbrella over her as he approaches. The woman looks up at him with eyes that are a startling shade of blue, the kind of clear, piercing blue that makes you feel like they can see right through you. A lifetime of laugh lines frame those eyes, though at the moment, she looks tired. "Yes, I did. Thank you for coming out in this weather." Her voice is warm, slightly raspy with age but strong. "No problem at all. Let me help you with that," Jack says, reaching for her bag. "I'm Jack Harmon." "Eleanor Walsh," she replies, relinquishing the small overnight bag. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Harmon." "Just Jack is fine," he says, offering her his arm. She's slight, maybe 5'2", and though she doesn't appear frail, Jack can feel how the damp cold has seeped into her bones when she takes his arm. Her hand trembles slightly against his sleeve. As they walk to the cab, Jack notices she's wearing a thin jacket that's clearly not meant for this weather. The shoulders are dark with rainwater. He opens the back passenger door for her, but Eleanor shakes her head. "If you don't mind, I'd prefer the front. These old eyes like to see where I'm going these days." Jack smiles and opens the front passenger door instead. "As you wish." Once Eleanor is settled, Jack puts her bag in the trunk and hurries back to the driver's side, folding his umbrella and giving it a good shake before climbing in. The interior of the cab smells faintly of pine air freshener and the coffee Jack had been nursing throughout his shift. "You're soaked," Jack observes, noticing how the rain has worked its way through Eleanor's rain bonnet and jacket. He turns up the heat and adjusts the vents to point in her direction. Then, reaching into the glove compartment, he pulls out a clean, folded hand towel, one of several he keeps for emergencies. "Here you go." Eleanor accepts the towel with a grateful nod. "That's very thoughtful. Most people don't prepare for emergencies anymore." "My wife always said I was a Boy Scout at heart," Jack replies, putting the cab in drive. "Never actually was one, though. Where are we headed tonight?" Eleanor gives him an address on Cedar Street, in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Jack knows it well. Mostly older homes, many dating back to the early 1900s, now divided into apartments. It's about a 20-minute drive in good weather, likely closer to 30 in this downpour. "Cedar Street it is," Jack confirms, pulling away from the hospital entrance. "Nasty night to be out. Doctor's appointment run late?" Eleanor dabs at her damp hair with the towel. "No, not a patient. I volunteer there 3 times a week in the oncology ward. Been doing it since I retired from nursing 15 years ago. Can't seem to stay away completely." "That's admirable," Jack says, navigating through the hospital parking lot. "Especially at..." He catches himself before finishing the thought, realizing it might sound impolite. Eleanor chuckles. "At my age? It's all right, I'm 76 and not shy about it. Keeps me busy. My Henry passed away 17 years ago, and the grandkids are all grown. The patients and staff are like family now." Something about Eleanor's gentle demeanor and the way she speaks of the hospital with such fondness reminds Jack of Sarah. His wife had formed close bonds with her nurses during her 3-month stay in oncology. She'd always been that way, making friends wherever she went, finding the humanity in sterile places. "My late wife spent some time in that ward," Jack says quietly, surprising himself. He rarely mentions Sarah to strangers. Something about this woman, though, perhaps her connection to the place where he'd last held Sarah's hand, loosens his tongue. "I'm sorry for your loss," Eleanor replies, and Jack can tell she means it. Not the reflexive condolence of a stranger, but the genuine empathy of someone who understands grief intimately. "Cancer is a cruel disease." Jack nods, focusing on the road ahead, as they merge onto the rain-slicked streets of downtown Portland. The conversation lulls for a moment, filled only by the sound of tires on wet pavement and the rhythmic swish of wipers. "How long have you been driving taxis?" Eleanor asks after a while. "Almost 30 years now," Jack replies. "Started part-time when Sarah and I were saving for a house. Then the company I was working for downsized, and I ended up doing this full-time. Never went back to accounting." "Do you enjoy it?" Jack considers the question. It's been a long time since anyone asked him that. "Most days, I like the freedom, meeting different people. Every fare is a different story. Some days are harder than others." The rain intensifies as they drive through the darkened streets. Water cascades off rooftops and floods the gutters. Jack slows the cab, peering carefully through the windshield where the wipers struggle to keep up. "Days like today, I question my career choices," he jokes, gripping the wheel a little tighter as they hit a patch of standing water. Eleanor smiles, watching the rain. "We had a night like this last month. One of my patients, a young woman with lymphoma, had her boyfriend propose to her right in the hospital room during a storm like this. Said he couldn't wait another day." The thunder was so loud, it nearly drowned out her yes. Jack finds himself smiling at the story. That's beautiful. It is, Eleanor agrees. That's why I keep going back. Even in a place with so much suffering, you witness these incredible moments of human connection. Life doesn't stop at the hospital doors. As they pass through downtown, the traffic light ahead turns yellow. Jack slows to a stop, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. Eleanor continues talking about her volunteer work, how she started in pediatrics but moved to oncology after her husband died of lung cancer. I felt drawn to it, she explains. I understand what those families are going through. Sometimes, when a patient is alone, I sit with them. No one should face those moments without someone to hold their hand. Jack swallows hard, thinking of Sarah. He had been driving double shifts toward the end, desperately trying to cover the mounting medical bills their insurance wouldn't pay. He'd visit Sarah when he could, but those visits grew shorter as their financial situation worsened. The memory of rushing to the hospital after his cab got a flat tire, only to arrive 15 minutes after she had passed, still haunts him. That means more than you know, Jack says quietly as the light turns green. To the families, I mean. A flash of lightning suddenly illuminates the interior of the cab, followed by a rumble of thunder that seems to shake the very ground. In that brief moment of brightness, Jack's eyes catch a glimpse of something familiar on Eleanor's wrist. A distinctive silver bracelet with small turquoise stones arranged in a flowing pattern. His heart skips a beat. The cab swerves slightly before he regains control, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. It's impossible, but he'd recognize that bracelet anywhere. It was the first gift he'd ever given Sarah, on their one-year dating anniversary. She had worn it every day since, even in the hospital where she'd insisted on keeping it on despite the multiple IV lines. Mr. Harmon? Jack? Are you all right? Eleanor's concerned voice seems to come from far away. Jack can barely hear her over the blood rushing in his ears. His eyes keep darting to the bracelet on her wrist, identical in every detail to the one he had placed on Sarah's arm 28 years ago. Sir, you're scaring me. Do you need to pull over? With tremendous effort, Jack guides the cab to the curb, puts it in park, and turns on the hazard lights. Rain pounds on the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. His hands tremble as he stares at the bracelet, unable to look away. The coincidence is too great, the timing too perfect. I'm sorry, he manages finally, his voice barely audible over the storm. That bracelet. Eleanor follows his gaze to her wrist, touching the silver and turquoise band with her other hand. This? She asks, confused. Jack nods, unable to form words. The cab feels too small suddenly, the air too thick. Outside, the rain continues to fall in sheets, isolating them in this moment of impossible recognition. Where did you get it? He finally asks, though he thinks he already knows the answer, an answer that will connect him to his wife one last time, through the woman sitting beside him on this stormy October night. Where did you get it? Jack asks again, his voice steadier now, but still tense. Eleanor looks down at the bracelet, confused by Jack's reaction. She traces the turquoise stones with her fingertip, a habit she's developed over the years. This? A patient gave it to me about 3 years ago. She was... Eleanor pauses, studying Jack's face more carefully. Understanding slowly dawns in her eyes. Your wife? Sarah was your wife, wasn't she? Sarah Harmon. Jack nods, unable to speak. The rain drums against the roof of the cab, filling the silence between them. I remember her so clearly. Eleanor continues softly. Room 418, by the window. She always asked us to keep the curtains open, even on rainy days like this. Said it made her feel less trapped. Jack's throat tightens. That was Sarah, always seeking the light, even in her darkest moments. She was special, Eleanor says. In 30 years of nursing, you meet thousands of patients, but some stay with you. Sarah was one of those. Jack finally finds his voice. She gave you her bracelet. She never took it off. Not even... He stops, the memory too painful. Eleanor shifts in her seat to face him more directly. It was her last day. I don't know if you knew, but she had a moment of clarity that morning. Sometimes patients do right before... She doesn't finish the sentence. She asked for a pen and paper, wrote something, and then she took off this bracelet. Jack remembers that day with agonizing precision. His cab had gotten a flat tire across town. By the time he'd changed it and rushed to the hospital, the doctor was already expressing condolences. He'd never forgiven himself for not being there. She knew it was time, Eleanor continues. She told me, my Jack gave me this on our first anniversary. Said it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. She put it in my hand and closed my fingers around it. Said, you've been my friend when I needed one most. A tear slides down Jack's cheek. He doesn't wipe it away. I was with her, Mr. Harmon. She wasn't alone. Eleanor's voice is gentle but firm. She asked me to stay, and I did. Held her hand until the end. I should have been there, Jack whispers. She knew you were trying to get there. The nurse at the station called down when you arrived. Sarah waited as long as she could. Eleanor reaches out hesitantly, then places her hand on Jack's arm. Her last words were about you. Tell Jack it's okay. Tell him I understand why he worked so hard. Jack closes his eyes, overwhelmed. For 3 years, he's carried the weight of his absence, imagining Sarah dying alone while he was stuck in traffic. The knowledge that she'd had someone with her, someone kind who'd earned her trust, brings both pain and profound relief. I tried to find you afterward, Eleanor admits. I asked the hospital staff, but patient confidentiality, and then my sister got sick in Buffalo. I had to leave town for several months. When I came back, I didn't know how to reach you. Jack opens his eyes and looks at the bracelet again. All this time you've been wearing it. Eleanor nods. Every day. It felt important to honor her request, like I was carrying a piece of her story with me. She pauses. I think somehow she knew we'd meet eventually. Outside, the rain begins to lighten, the drumming on the roof softening to a gentle patter. I've been so angry, Jack admits. At myself, at God, at the whole situation. Working myself to exhaustion trying to pay those medical bills only to miss her final moments. She wasn't angry with you, Eleanor says firmly. Not at all. She was proud of you, Jack. Talked about you all the time. How hard you worked. How you never complained even when you were exhausted. Jack wipes his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Eleanor replies. Some things are beyond words. Jack puts the cab back in drive, pulling carefully away from the curb. They drive in silence for several blocks, both lost in thoughts of Sarah. The city streets glisten under the streetlights, the storm moving on, leaving everything washed clean. Would you? Jack begins tentatively. Would you tell me more about her last days? The parts I missed while I was working? No one's ever really talked to me about it. Eleanor smiles sadly. I'd be honored to. She was braver than you can imagine. As they drive toward Cedar Street, Eleanor begins to share her memories of Sarah, how she befriended the cleaning staff who came to her room, how she kept a photo of Jack by her bed, how she never lost her sense of humor even in her final week. With each story, Jack feels something shift inside him. Not the erasure of grief, but perhaps the beginning of its transformation into something he can carry more gently. By the time they reach Eleanor's apartment building, the rain has stopped completely. A few stars peek through breaks in the clouds overhead. I live on the second floor, Eleanor says, gesturing to a well-maintained brick building. Would you like to come up for a cup of tea? I have something I think you should see. Jack follows Eleanor up the narrow staircase to her second-floor apartment. The building is old but well-maintained. Polished wooden banisters, faded floral wallpaper, the slight creak of floorboards that have supported decades of footsteps. It reminds him of his grandmother's house from childhood, carrying that same sense of history and quiet dignity. It's nothing fancy, Eleanor says as she unlocks her door, but it's home. The apartment is small but warm, a tidy living room with well-worn furniture, bookshelves lining one wall, and family photos covering another. A gray tabby cat stretches lazily on a crocheted blanket draped over an armchair, opening one eye to regard the visitor with mild interest before returning to its nap. That's Fitzgerald, Eleanor explains, hanging her damp jacket on a hook by the door. Don't take it personally. He's equally indifferent to everyone. Jack stands awkwardly in the entryway, suddenly aware that he's entering the home of a stranger who somehow feels intimately familiar through their shared connection to Sarah. Please make yourself comfortable, Eleanor gestures to the small sofa. I'll put on some tea. As Eleanor moves to the kitchenette separated from the living room by a small counter, Jack takes a seat, his eyes drawn to the photographs on the wall. Many show Eleanor with what must be her children and grandchildren. In others, she's younger, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and a military bearing. Henry, he assumes. Chamomile all right? Eleanor calls. Or I have Earl Grey. Chamomile is fine, thank you, Jack replies, his eyes now landing on a small set of framed photos on an end table. One catches his attention, a group picture of hospital staff and volunteers. Eleanor stands in the back row, wearing the same bracelet that had stopped his heart in the cab. Eleanor returns with 2 steaming mugs, setting them on coasters on the coffee table. She follows Jack's gaze to the photo. Annual volunteer appreciation dinner 2 years ago, she explains, sitting in the armchair across from him, gently nudging Fitzgerald to make room. Sarah's bracelet was always a conversation starter. Jack wraps his hands around the warm mug but doesn't drink. It still doesn't seem real. All this time. Eleanor sips her tea, then sets down her mug. Life has a way of coming full circle when you least expect it. She stands up. There's something I want to show you. She disappears into a back room and returns carrying a small wooden box, the kind that might hold jewelry or keepsakes. Sitting back down, she places it on her lap and opens it carefully. Over 40 years of nursing, you form bonds with people at their most vulnerable moments, she explains, looking down at the contents of the box. Most pass through your life briefly, but some leave an imprint. I keep a small memento from those special patients, ones who changed me in some way. She turns the box so Jack can see inside. It contains an eclectic collection of small items, a child's drawing, a polished stone, a pressed flower, a military pin, various notes written on scraps of paper. "This is from Marjorie, who taught me to knit during her chemotherapy sessions," Eleanor says, touching a small knitted heart. "This shell is from Thomas, a marine biologist who told me about his research until the very end. This coin was from a World War II veteran who survived Normandy only to be taken by lymphoma at 89 years old." Jack listens, understanding what she's showing him. Evidence of a life spent witnessing others' final chapters, carrying their stories forward. Eleanor carefully moves these items aside, reaching deeper into the box. "And this," she says, pulling out a sealed envelope, "is from Sarah." Jack stares at the envelope. His name is written on the front in Sarah's handwriting. The familiar loops of her letters, the way she always made the J in Jack a little too elaborate. His hands shake as Eleanor passes it to him. "She wrote it the morning of her last day, asked me to keep it safe, said I'd know when the right time came to pass it on." Eleanor's voice is soft. "I think tonight is that time." Jack holds the envelope, feeling the weight of it, not its physical heft, but the emotional gravity of Sarah's final words to him. The paper has yellowed slightly along the edges. The seal remains unbroken. "I'll give you some privacy," Eleanor says, rising from her chair. "Take all the time you need." As Eleanor disappears into the kitchen, Jack turns the envelope over in his hands. For 3 years, he's replayed his last conversation with Sarah in his mind. A hurried goodbye, a promise to return soon, a kiss on her forehead before rushing back to work. He never imagined there might be more. With careful fingers, he breaks the seal and removes a single sheet of paper, unfolding it to reveal Sarah's handwriting. The letters are shakier than her usual script, but unmistakably hers. He begins to read, "My dearest Jack, if you're reading this, then somehow my bracelet has found its way back to you, just as I hoped it would. Eleanor promised to keep it safe until the right moment. She has been a blessing during these final days. My friend when you couldn't be here. My confidant when I needed to speak the truths I was too afraid would break your heart. First, I need you to know this. I have never, not for 1 second, blamed you for working so hard while I was ill. You were fighting for us in your way, just as I was fighting in mine. Different battlefields, same war. I've seen how the guilt eats at you each time you rush in from another double shift, apologizing for not being here more often. Please release that burden. You have nothing to apologize for. The doctors told me yesterday what I've suspected for weeks. Time is short now. I could wait. Hope you'll be here at the very end. But that's asking the impossible of both fate and you. Instead, I'm writing these words while I still can. Giving them to someone who I trust will find you when the moment is right. Do you remember the day you gave me this bracelet? That picnic at Casco Bay, when it started pouring rain and we huddled under that too small umbrella, laughing like fools. You were so nervous when you gave it to me. Something beautiful for someone beautiful, you said. I've never taken it off since that day, until today. I'm giving it to Eleanor for safekeeping, knowing somehow it will find its way back to you. Maybe in a month, maybe in years. When it does, I hope it brings not just memories of me, but a reminder that love continues beyond loss. My time with you has been the greatest gift of my life. Jack Harmon. Our story isn't ending, it's just changing shape. Find joy again. Look for the small moments of grace that make life worth living, and know that somewhere, somehow, I'm still loving you. Just as I always have, just as I always will. All my love, Sarah. Jack reads the letter twice, then a third time, tears flowing freely down his face. He makes no attempt to wipe them away. In Sarah's words, he finds not just a farewell, but a release. Permission to forgive himself for what he's carried as failure these past 3 years. From the kitchen, he hears the gentle clink of dishes being washed. Eleanor giving him the space to absorb this moment privately. He folds the letter carefully and returns it to its envelope before calling out to her. "Eleanor?" She appears in the doorway, drying her hands on a small towel. "Are you all right?" "Getting there," Jack answers honestly. Did you know what she wrote?" Eleanor shakes her head. "Number that was between you and Sarah. But I knew it was important. She was very particular about sealing it herself, even though her hands were weak by then." Eleanor returns to her chair, and for a while they sit in companionable silence, the only sounds being the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel and Fitzgerald's occasional purr. "She wasn't always alone when I was working," Jack finally says. "She had you." Eleanor nods. "And others." "She was well loved, Jack. The nurses adored her. She kept track of all their children's names, their birthdays, even made one of the nursing assistants promise to send her wedding photos, though she knew." Eleanor's voice catches. "That's Sarah," Jack says, a smile breaking through his tears. Always investing in people's futures, even when her own was slipping away. Eleanor reaches for her tea. "She talked about you constantly, you know. Kept your photo by her bed. She'd tell anyone who would listen about your kindness, your work ethic, how you met when your cab broke down outside her office building and she offered you coffee while you waited for the tow truck." Jack laughs softly at the memory. "She emptied her entire purse looking for change for the vending machine. She told me that story," Eleanor says, smiling. "Said it was the best car trouble anyone ever had." For the next hour, they share stories of Sarah, Jack talking about their early years together, their struggles and triumphs, the small traditions they'd created in 25 years of marriage. Eleanor offers glimpses of the Sarah he hadn't seen, her courage in the face of pain, her concern for other patients even while suffering herself, her quiet dignity as she faced the inevitable. Outside, the sky has cleared completely. Moonlight streams through Eleanor's curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. The storm has passed, leaving behind the fresh scent of rain-washed air drifting through a cracked window. "It's getting late," Eleanor observes, glancing at the clock. "Almost 11. Jack realizes he's kept his cab out of service for over 2 hours. Strangely, the thought of lost fares doesn't bother him. This evening has given him something far more valuable than money. "I should go," he agrees, though reluctantly. "Thank you for the tea. And for..." He looks down at the letter in his hands, unable to articulate the magnitude of what she's given him. "You don't need to thank me," Eleanor says. "Sarah knew what she was doing when she gave me that bracelet. She was building a bridge across time, hoping it would reach you when you needed it most." As Jack stands to leave, Eleanor reaches for his hand, the silver bracelet on her wrist catching the lamplight. "Jack," she says hesitantly, "would you consider coming to the hospital sometime? The volunteer coordinator is always looking for help. Your experience, not just as a driver, but as someone who understands what families are going through, could be valuable." Jack hasn't set foot in Maine Medical's oncology ward since the day he collected Sarah's belongings. The thought of returning makes his heart race. Yet something in Sarah's letter resonates with him. Her encouragement to find new purpose, to look for moments of grace. "I'll think about it," he promises. At the door, Eleanor surprises him with a quick hug. "Don't be a stranger, Jack Harmon. I think we were meant to find each other." As Jack walks down the stairs and out to his waiting cab, he feels lighter than he has in years. The night air is cool and fresh after the rain. Above, stars punctuate the clearing sky. He slides into the driver's seat, but doesn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he takes out Sarah's letter once more, running his fingers over her handwriting in the dim glow of the street lamp. "Our story isn't ending. It's just changing shape," she had written. For the first time since her death, Jack allows himself to believe this might be true. He starts the engine and pulls away from the curb, the city quiet around him. In his rearview mirror, he catches a glimpse of Eleanor's window, where a light still burns. Jack makes a mental note to call the volunteer office tomorrow. Maybe it's time for his story to change shape too. 2 weeks later, Jack pulls his yellow cab up to the familiar circular driveway of Maine Medical Center. This time, he's not here to pick up a fare. He turns off the engine and sits for a moment, gathering his courage. Through the windshield, he watches doctors, nurses, and visitors stream in and out of the sliding glass doors. A constant flow of humanity navigating moments of crisis, healing, and loss. Jack checks his watch. 9:45 a.m. He'd promised Eleanor he'd meet her before her volunteer shift at 10 a.m. After their chance meeting, they'd spoken several times by phone, and Jack had finally agreed to visit the oncology ward. Not just to see where Sarah had spent her final months, but to explore Eleanor's suggestion about volunteering. The late October morning is crisp and clear, sunlight glinting off the hospital windows. Jack steps out of his cab carrying a cardboard tray with coffee and a box of donuts from Holy Donut, Sarah's favorite local bakery. A peace offering, perhaps, to the place he'd avoided for 3 years. In the lobby, he spots Eleanor immediately. She's chatting with the security guard, wearing a blue volunteer smock over a turtleneck sweater. Sarah's bracelet, or what he still thinks of as Sarah's bracelet, catches the fluorescent light as she gestures animatedly. When she sees him, her face brightens. "Jack, you came." She embraces him briefly, then notices his offerings. "And you brought provisions. The nursing staff will declare you a hero." "Just a small thank you," Jack says, suddenly feeling awkward, "for everything they did for Sarah." Eleanor leads him to the elevator, pressing the button for the 4th floor. As the doors close, Jack takes a deep breath. Eleanor seems to sense his anxiety. "It's okay to feel nervous," she says gently. "First time back is always the hardest." The elevator opens directly onto the oncology ward. Jack steps out hesitantly, immediately noticing how much has changed. The walls have been repainted in soft blues and greens. New artwork hangs in the corridors. Yet the underlying rhythm of the place remains the same. The quiet efficiency of the nurses' station, the soft beeping of monitors, the hushed conversations. "Sarah was in 418, Jack says, looking down the hallway. "End of the corridor on the right." Eleanor nods. "Do you want to see it?" "Not yet," Jack decides. "Maybe later." Instead, they walk to the nurses' station, where Eleanor introduces Jack to the staff. Some of the faces are familiar. Nurses who had cared for Sarah, who now greet him with warm recognition. Others are new, but welcome him with equal warmth when Eleanor explains who he is. "You're the famous Jack," says one nurse, an older woman named Diane who'd been one of Sarah's primary caregivers. "Sarah talked about you constantly." "All good things, I hope," Jack says, setting down the coffee and donuts on the counter. "The best," Diane assures him, squeezing his arm. It's good to see you again. As the staff helps themselves to coffee and donuts, Jack observes the ward with new eyes. When Sarah was a patient, he'd seen only her illness, her room, the machines sustaining her. Now he notices the small touches of humanity, a volunteer reading to an elderly patient, the gentle way a nurse adjusts a young woman's pillows, the carefully arranged flowers brightening windowsills. We have a new program starting next month, Eleanor tells him as they walk through the corridor. Transportation assistance for outpatients who have no way to get to their appointments. The hospital received a grant, but they're still figuring out the logistics. Jack listens attentively, realizing this is why Eleanor had been so eager for him to visit. Not just for closure, but because she saw a way he could help. You think they could use a cab driver? He asks. I think they could use you, Eleanor corrects him. Someone who understands both driving and what these families are going through. They spend the next hour touring the ward. Jack meets patients and family members, observing Eleanor's easy way with them. How she remembers specific details about their lives. How she offers just the right balance of sympathy and normalcy. In her presence, he finds it easier to be here than he expected. Eventually, they reach room 418. Jack pauses outside the door, which stands open to reveal an empty, freshly made bed. Would you like a moment? Eleanor asks. Jack nods, stepping into the room alone. It looks different. New paint, new curtains, different equipment. But the view from the window is the same one Sarah had watched during those long days. He moves to stand beside it, looking out at the city skyline, the harbor visible in the distance. I'm back, Sarah, he whispers. He stands there for several minutes, not speaking, just feeling her presence in this space. When he finally turns to leave, he feels something settle within him. Not an end to grief, but a transformation of it into something he can carry more lightly. In the hallway, Eleanor waits patiently. When Jack emerges, she studies his face. You okay? Getting there, he says honestly. They walk toward the volunteer office where Jack has an appointment with the coordinator to discuss the transportation program. On the way, Eleanor stops abruptly, her expression serious. I have something for you, she says, reaching for the bracelet on her wrist. She unfastens it carefully. This belongs with you now. Jack shakes his head. Sarah gave it to you. She wanted you to have it. She gave it to me for safekeeping until it found its way back to you. Eleanor corrects him, holding out the bracelet. It's completed its journey, Jack. When Jack hesitates, Eleanor takes his hand and places the bracelet in his palm, closing his fingers around it. The silver feels warm from her wrist, the turquoise stones smooth against his skin. Some things come full circle, she tells him. Sarah knew you would need a reminder that love continues even after loss. Jack looks down at the bracelet, the first gift he ever gave Sarah, now returned to him through this unexpected friendship. After a moment, he fastens it around his own wrist, the metal cool against his pulse point. Thank you, he says simply. They continue to the volunteer office where Jack meets with Maggie, the coordinator. He explains his idea, a program he calls Sarah's Rides, offering free transportation to patients who have no other means of getting to their treatments. I can coordinate with other cab drivers, Jack explains. Create a rotating schedule. Maybe start with 1 day a week and see how it goes. Maggie's enthusiasm is immediate. This addresses our biggest challenge with the grant. We have funding but no infrastructure. Your experience is exactly what we need. By the time Jack leaves the hospital an hour later, He's filled out volunteer paperwork and scheduled training for the following week. Outside, the autumn sun breaks through the clouds, casting warm light across the parking lot. He feels Sarah's presence not as a painful absence, but as a guiding force, pushing him toward this new purpose. As he reaches his cab, he notices a young couple near the hospital entrance. The woman is helping a man into a wheelchair. He's thin, with the unmistakable pallor of someone undergoing chemotherapy. They look around anxiously, clearly waiting for transportation. Without hesitation, Jack approaches them. "Waiting for a ride?" he asks. The woman nods, worry etched on her tired face. "We called a cab 20 minutes ago. My husband just finished his treatment and needs to get home to rest." Jack glances at his watch. He's officially off duty, but something tells him this is exactly where he's meant to be. "I can take you," he offers, gesturing to his cab. "Don't worry about the fare. This one's on Sarah." The couple looks confused but grateful. As Jack helps the man into his cab, he catches a glimpse of the silver bracelet on his wrist, glinting in the sunlight. For the first time in 3 years, the sight brings not pain, but a sense of rightness, of coming home. Behind him, on the second floor of the hospital, Eleanor watches from a window. She raises her hand in a small wave as Jack's cab pulls away from the curb, carrying its passengers toward home. The circle is complete. The bracelet has fulfilled its purpose. And somewhere, Eleanor is certain, Sarah is smiling.